Hey, how are you? Matt Heisler here. Today we're going to tackle one of the subjects I probably get asked more about by first time buyers than any other: closing costs. What are closing costs? Closing costs basically are the sum of the transaction fees you get charged when you buy a house, usually including the mortgage fees because most people are getting mortgages. So that at the end of the day, you have to pay for the house, and then there's all these other charges, and those other charges are what we call closing costs. There are two types. There are one-time fees and prepays. So prepays are money for future bills. It's very common for almost all the closings that I do for the bank to require that a certain amount of money for the future, including home insurance and taxes, that all be put into a special account and saved, that the bank watches so that they can pay your bills down the road. We call those prepays, and ultimately that's money that you're giving yourself so that you won't have to pay for something later. So I don't really count prepays when you're comparing loans. So if you're looking at one loan and the closing costs are $7,000 and one loan and the closing costs are $8,000, you have to go strip out what they're thinking the prepays might be in order to really compare the two loans together. Um, Anything left over that's not a prepay is a closing cost, at least as far as I'm concerned, because it's money that you pay just then at the closing table and you never get the money back. So to me, that's a cost. The fees, ultimately, closing costs can vary. There's all sorts of different charges. Banks all do it differently. But for typical loans, they tend to be between 2,500 and 4,000. Those are the numbers that I see the most often. Usually loans are a little bit cheaper if you're putting more money down because it's a more competitive product. And the less money you put down, a lot of times the fees can start to work themselves up. And the last part is title insurance can add to the closing costs significantly, especially if it's an expensive property. So even if it's in an expensive property, title insurance is pretty expensive. Generally, when you own a house, you want to try to figure out how to pay for that as little as possible. But at the end of the day, now that we know what closing costs are, what we really want to know is, on the buyer side, can we get the seller to pay closing costs? A lot of buyers think that this is some sort of magic trick. It is not. So the seller does not care about whether or not they pay your closing costs. And the reason is because what they're looking at when they compare offers is they're looking at the net number, um, when they're comparing offers. And so for a seller, $400,000 with $5,000 back in closing costs, and that $5,000 goes to the buyer, is the same to the seller as $395,000 with no money back. It's pretty easy math to do. If someone's offering me $400,000 for the house, but I have to give them $5,000 later, I'm only left with $395,000. So someone else who's offering me $395,000 with no money to give back at all, it's the same price. So in a market, so and that's ultimately all the seller does. It doesn't really cost the seller anything. They know up front that this money is going to be spent on your closing costs, and typically it's not a problem in transactions. We do it all the time. However, in a market where appraisals are a problem, cash back for closing costs can hurt you in competitive bid situations. And the more competitive the bid situation, the more important that money back at closing can be. So the reason is because the house does have to appraise at the higher number, and brokers who are worried that their house isn't going to appraise may start to favor deals that don't have any closing costs embedded back into it. I mean, generally, closing costs that you're asking back is somewhere between $3,000 and $7,000, so it doesn't really change the value of the house that much. But some brokers are very careful about making sure that they don't run into an appraisal problem over money back at closing. Ultimately, okay, the money doesn't come from the seller. The money is really borrowed by the buyer and it's rolled into the mortgage. So the good news is you're not taking that $5,000 or whatever it is in closing costs and paying them at the table, but you are adding it to the loan. It gets added into the loan, and then over the next 30 years, you're going to pay it off at whatever your interest rate is. You can, of course, pay it down faster, just like you could on a credit card that had a large balance. But at the end of the day, the money is borrowed by the buyer. And that's why the seller doesn't care, because all the seller is doing is allowing you to restructure the deal so you can borrow more money. This tends to be a really good strategy for buyers that are cash strapped. If you're trying to get to 5% down so that you can get out of FHA loans, which is something I generally encourage, um, this is a good way to help solve the cash problem for doing that. If you can get the cash back at closing, sometimes that gives you more money to put down. Then you can get into a better loan product, and that can save you a lot of money all the way down the road. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out. I'm going to embed this video on my closing cost content. I have lots of other content on the blog about closing costs that has more details and more examples. Until next time, we'll see you later.